Imagine being the undisputed king of American beer. Your slogan, the beer that made Milwaukee famous, isn't just marketing, it's reality. Your name is known in every corner of the country. For decades, you've dominated an industry that defines American leisure and identity. You survived Prohibition while countless competitors collapsed into bankruptcy. You didn't just survive, you emerged stronger, larger, and more powerful than ever before. By the mid-20th century, you were no longer just a brewery, you were an institution. By the 1950s, your company stands at the absolute peak of American manufacturing success. Your breweries are marvels of industrial efficiency. Your distribution network reaches nearly every city, town, and highway rest stop in the nation. On Wall Street, analysts call you a textbook example of corporate excellence. Business schools study your methods. Investors trust your leadership. You and Budweiser battle relentlessly for the #1 spot, trading market share like heavyweight champions exchanging blows in the ring. Then comes 1973, the year everything appears perfect. This is your summit. Your profit margins are the highest in the entire beer industry. Your production processes are the most advanced in the world. Your breweries produce more beer faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. Executives speak confidently about the future. Shareholders are thrilled. From the outside, there is no sign of weakness, no hint that disaster is approaching. But beneath this polished surface, something dangerous is unfolding, quietly, methodically. A decision has already been made. Not a dramatic announcement, not a public shift, just a series of small changes, introduced gradually, almost invisibly. A little less barley here, a little more chemical assistance there. Shorter fermentation times, faster production cycles. Every change seems logical on paper. Every change improves efficiency. Every change boosts margins. At first, it works beautifully. Profits rise, stock prices climb. Management congratulates itself for being smarter, more modern, more innovative than the old-fashioned brewers of the past. But in the process, something essential is being forgotten. This empire was not built by spreadsheets or efficiency models. It was built by customers, by loyalty, by trust. And once that trust begins to erode, it disappears faster than anyone expects. In less than a decade, everything that once seemed unshakable will collapse. Factories will fall silent. Workers will lose careers that once lasted generations. The crown will be taken permanently. And the company that made Milwaukee famous will become a cautionary tale taught in business schools across the world. This is the story of Schlitz Brewery and the single fatal philosophy that destroyed America's biggest beer empire. 3. Under the management of the Uihlein family, the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company entered a phase of relentless expansion. The new leadership understood something fundamental. Scale was destiny in the American beer market. Small breweries could survive locally, but national dominance required consistency, technology, and an obsession with distribution. The Uihleins invested aggressively in modern brewing equipment, expanding production capacity at a pace that few competitors could match. They weren't just brewing more beer, they were building an industrial system designed to deliver the same product, tasting exactly the same no matter where it was consumed. This commitment to consistency became one of Schlitz's greatest strengths. One of their most influential innovations was the widespread adoption of brown glass bottles. At the time, beer was commonly sold in clear bottles, which allowed sunlight to penetrate and degrade the flavor, creating what drinkers often described as a skunky taste. Schlitz recognized that light exposure was a hidden enemy. Brown glass dramatically reduced this problem, preserving freshness and quality during long-distance shipping. It gave Schlitz a critical advantage as the company expanded beyond regional markets. They also refined their brewing processes, standardizing recipes and production methods across all facilities. Every bottle became a promise. The beer you drank in Milwaukee would taste the same in Chicago, New York, or San Francisco. This reliability built immense consumer trust at a time when many beers varied wildly in quality from batch to batch. By the early 20th century, the results were undeniable. In 1919, the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company achieved what once seemed impossible. It became the largest beer producer in the United States, producing over 1 million barrels per year. No American brewery had ever reached that scale before. Schlitz was no longer just a success story, it was the benchmark. They sealed their dominance with a slogan that captured both confidence and truth: the beer that made Milwaukee famous. Milwaukee had become synonymous with beer, and Schlitz stood at the center of that reputation. From a small brewery run by an immigrant accountant, the company had risen to dominate an entire industry in just over half a century. This was the American dream, bottled and sold by the millions. But, as history repeatedly shows, building an empire is far easier than sustaining it, and just as Schlitz reached its peak, a threat emerged that would destroy weaker breweries and test even the strongest. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect. Prohibition became law. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages were banned across the United States. Overnight, the product that had built Schlitz's empire became illegal. Breweries across the country collapsed almost immediately. Equipment was scrapped, buildings were abandoned, workers were sent home with no future to return to. Milwaukee's skyline, once dominated by brewing chimneys, began to fall silent. But Schlitz did not panic. The Uhlans believed prohibition would eventually end, and survival was the only objective. Their first move was subtle but essential. They changed the company's name from the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company to the Joseph Schlitz Beverage Company. Brewing was illegal, beverages were not. They retooled their massive factories to produce near beer, a non-alcoholic product containing less than 0.5% alcohol. It was legal, it was barely profitable, and most people disliked it. But it kept the Schlitz name alive and workers employed. More importantly, Schlitz began producing malt syrup, marketed innocently for baking and cooking. Everyone understood its real purpose: home brewing. Families across America bought Schlitz malt syrup and followed the helpful instructions included on the packaging. It was technically legal, morally questionable, and commercially brilliant. For 13 long years, Schlitz endured while competitors disappeared. Pabst struggled, Miller barely survived. Anheuser-Busch clung to life producing ice cream and near beer. Schlitz, however, preserved its workforce, its facilities, and its distribution network. So, when Prohibition was repealed on December 3, 1933, Schlitz was ready. Within hours, trucks rolled. Within days, shelves were stocked. Within months, Schlitz reclaimed its position as the #1 brewer in America, and soon after, the world. While others scrambled to restart, Schlitz simply flipped a switch. The empire had survived its greatest external threat, but the internal decisions that would eventually destroy it were still decades away, quietly waiting. 4. The years following Prohibition marked the beginning of Schlitz's true golden age. The 1940s and 50s were a time of explosive growth for the United States, and beer flowed at the center of American life. Soldiers returned home from World War II, started families, bought houses, and celebrated prosperity in backyards, bars, and ballparks. And more often than not, the beer in their hands was Schlitz. Milwaukee transformed into what would later be called the Silicon Valley of brewing. 4 massive beer empires dominated the city: Schlitz, Miller, Pabst, and Blatz. Towering brick breweries defined the skyline. The air itself often smelled faintly of malt and hops. Working at one of these breweries wasn't just a job, it was a career, and often a lifelong one. A young man could start on the bottling line, learn the craft, move into management, and retire decades later with a pension that supported his family. With a single brewery paycheck, workers bought homes, sent their children to college, and built the post-war American middle class. Schlitz wasn't just producing beer, it was producing stability, pride, and identity. But dominance attracts challengers.
In St. Louis, a rival was rising with relentless ambition: Anheuser-Busch, the maker of Budweiser. Throughout the 1950s, Schlitz and Budweiser engaged in an epic year-by-year battle for the #1 spot in American beer. One year Schlitz led, the next year Budweiser surged ahead, then Schlitz clawed back. They traded the crown like heavyweight boxers trading punches. Neither company was willing to concede. Marketing budgets exploded. Television and radio became battlegrounds. Billboards and stadium sponsorships saturated the country. Beer was no longer just a drink, it was identity. Choosing Schlitz meant loyalty to Milwaukee, to tradition, to German brewing heritage. Choosing Budweiser meant modernity, scale, and American ambition. Milwaukee wore its brewing dominance with pride. Tens of thousands were employed by the industry. The city stood as proof that American manufacturing could compete globally and win. Schlitz seemed invincible, a permanent fixture at the top of American industry. But cracks were forming beneath the surface. In the summer of 1953, tensions between brewery workers and management reached a breaking point. Wages had failed to keep up with post-war inflation. Working conditions in the hot, dangerous breweries remained harsh. The unions prepared for confrontation, and management underestimated their resolve. On June 1, 1953, workers at Schlitz, Pabst, Blatz, and Miller walked off the job simultaneously. Every major brewery in Milwaukee shut down at once. Management assumed the strike would be brief. It wasn't. 76 days passed, more than 2.5 months. The brewery sat silent. Distribution networks built over decades became useless overnight. Shelves emptied, bars ran dry. Loyal Schlitz drinkers across the country walked into stores and found nothing where their beer should have been. And nature abhors a vacuum. 300 miles south in St. Louis, Anheuser-Busch was fully operational. Budweiser flooded the markets Schlitz had abandoned. Trucks rolled into neighborhoods that had been Schlitz territory for generations. Bars switched taps, stores filled coolers. Customers hesitated at first, then adapted. They discovered something uncomfortable. Budweiser was fine. By the time the strike ended in August, Schlitz workers had won better wages and conditions, a victory for labor. But Schlitz had lost something far more difficult to reclaim: habit. Drinking habits changed, and once consumers switched, many never switched back. Schlitz briefly reclaimed the #1 spot in 1954 through aggressive promotions, but the damage was permanent. Budweiser learned Schlitz could be beaten. By 1957, Budweiser took the crown and never relinquished it again. Schlitz management misread the warning. They saw a temporary setback, not a structural lesson. They were still profitable, still powerful, still #2, and that misinterpretation would push them towards the decisions that truly sealed their fate.
5. The lesson Schlitz should have learned from the 1953 strike was simple and brutal. Availability and consistency mattered more than brand loyalty. When beer disappeared from shelves, customers moved on, and once they moved on, many never returned. Market share, once lost, was extraordinarily difficult to reclaim. But Schlitz management drew a very different conclusion. Instead of seeing reliability and product quality as the foundation of dominance, executives concluded that the real problem was cost. If Schlitz could no longer guarantee the #1 position in volume, then the future lay elsewhere: profit margins, efficiency, financial optimization. If they couldn't beat Budweiser in scale, they would beat them in profitability. This philosophical shift marked the beginning of the end. At the center of this transformation were two men whose decisions would quietly dismantle everything Schlitz had built. The first was Bob Martin. The second was Robert Uihlein, Jr. Bob Martin joined Schlitz in 1952 as a young market research analyst, fresh out of college, earning $300 a month. He was intelligent, ambitious, and convinced he was smarter than nearly everyone around him. Within 3 years, he was promoted to head of the research department, not because research was valued, but because no one at Schlitz paid much attention to it at all. Martin did. He believed information was power, that consumer behavior could be manipulated, that marketing wasn't about persuasion, but control. He cultivated relationships with distributors, bar owners, and retailers, using gifts, favors, and carefully disguised incentives. It wasn't bribery, he insisted, it was just how business worked, and the results spoke for themselves. By the 1960s, Martin had risen to senior vice president, overseeing marketing across the entire company. His aggressive tactics delivered short-term gains that executives loved, and those gains reinforced the belief that ethics, tradition, and restraint were obstacles rather than safeguards. Then came Robert Uihlein Jr. When he became chairman and CEO in 1967, Schlitz entered a new era. Unlike earlier generations of leadership, Uihlein was not a brewer at heart. He was a modern executive. To him, beer was not a craft, but a product. Brewing was not tradition, but a manufacturing process, and the company itself was a machine to be optimized. His philosophy was deceptively elegant. Small changes made gradually could transform profitability without anyone noticing. He called it salami slicing. Adjust one ingredient slightly, speed up one process, replace one component with something cheaper. Each change alone seemed harmless. Together, they fundamentally altered the product. Uihlein believed modern chemistry and technology could replace time, patience, and craftsmanship. Long fermentation times looked like waste. Expensive ingredients looked inefficient. Traditional brewers were dismissed as sentimental and outdated. Data, computers, and optimization models would lead the future. In the 1960s, Schlitz invested heavily in cutting-edge technology, including a state-of-the-art brewery in Baldwinsville, New York, featuring continuous fermentation. Beer could now be produced faster than ever before. Management proudly marketed this as scientific precision, branding Schlitz as the most carefully brewed beer in the world. But carefully was a word doing a lot of work. What it really meant was faster, cheaper, more efficient. Every short-term metric improved. Costs fell, margins rose, investors applauded. Wall Street praised Schlitz as a model of modern corporate excellence. And with every positive report, management became more confident that they were right. They couldn't see what they were losing, because the beer itself was changing. And once customers noticed, there would be no turning back. 6. By the early 1970s, Robert Uihlein Jr.'s strategy appeared to be working flawlessly. On paper, Schlitz looked healthier than it had in decades. The company was still the second largest brewer in the United States, but the gap with Budweiser was narrowing. Market share was growing faster than almost every major competitor. Revenues were rising year after year. Profit margins were expanding at a pace that thrilled investors. Wall Street was euphoric. Financial analysts praised Schlitz as a case study in modern corporate transformation. Business magazines described the company as disciplined, innovative, and ruthlessly efficient. Executives were profiled as visionaries who had embraced technology instead of clinging to outdated traditions. Business schools began teaching Schlitz as an example of how data-driven management could outperform legacy thinking. And then came 1973. This was the absolute peak. Schlitz's profit-to-sales ratio was the highest in the entire beer industry, higher than Budweiser, higher than Miller, higher than anyone. Their breweries were considered among the most efficient in the world, squeezing more output from each facility than competitors thought possible. Capacity utilization exceeded industry norms. Every metric executives cared about was pointing straight up. The Baldwinsville, New York brewery stood as the symbol of this new era. Continuous fermentation technology allowed beer to move from raw ingredients to finished product at unprecedented speed. IBM computer systems monitored each stage of production, making constant micro-adjustments to reduce waste and maximize yield. Internally, the process was called accelerated batch fermentation. In advertising, it became accurate, balanced fermentation. The language was deliberate. Accelerated sounded rushed. Accurate sounded scientific. Balanced sounded safe.
But beneath the sleek terminology and gleaming stainless steel tanks, the product had fundamentally changed. Traditional Schlitz beer had relied heavily on malted barley, the backbone of flavor and body in classic lagers. The new formula replaced much of that barley with corn syrup, a cheaper alternative that fermented faster but produced a thinner, less complex beer. Fresh hops were replaced with hop pellets and extracts, easier to store and cheaper to source, but lacking aroma and character. Most critically, fermentation time was slashed. Where traditional lagering took around 40 days, Schlitz cut it to just 15. There was no meaningful aging period. Beer rushed through the system, chemically complete, but spiritually unfinished. It met legal definitions, it passed internal tests, but it was not the beer that had built the empire. The rushed process created another issue. When refrigerated, the beer developed a cloudy haze, something consumers associated with spoilage. Instead of slowing down, Schlitz added silica gel to the brewing process to clarify the beer. It worked visually, but it was a chemical solution to a problem caused entirely by speed. These decisions were not hidden accidents, they were calculated trade-offs, and management believed consumers would never notice. For a brief moment, they were right. Sales remained strong, profits climbed, the numbers looked perfect. But beneath the surface, the foundation of trust was eroding. Customers didn't need to understand brewing science to know something was wrong. The beer tasted different, thinner, less satisfying. And once drinkers begin to question a product, confidence evaporates fast. Schlitz was standing at the highest point it would ever reach, and the fall was already inevitable.
7. The first signs of trouble didn't come from Wall Street, regulators, or competitors. They came from ordinary drinkers, people who had grown up with Schlitz, people who had trusted the brand for decades. Quietly at first, then louder, consumers began to notice that something wasn't right. The beer didn't taste the same. It wasn't a dramatic rejection. There was no single moment of outrage. Instead, there were small hesitations. A drinker finishing a can and feeling less satisfied. A bartender noticing more half-finished glasses. A loyal customer trying another brand just this once. These micro-decisions spread faster than executives realized. Complaints started to reach distributors. Bars reported customers asking why Schlitz tasted different. Retailers noticed sales slowing in key markets. Internally, warning signals appeared, but they were filtered through layers of management obsessed with efficiency metrics and quarterly performance. The numbers still looked acceptable, so the concerns were dismissed. Then came Hawaii. In 1964, Schlitz had acquired Primo Brewery, a beloved local Hawaiian brand. By 1971, Primo controlled roughly 70% of the Hawaiian beer market, an extraordinary level of dominance in a region known for strong local loyalty. Schlitz decided to apply its new efficiency model to Primo, introducing accelerated fermentation and ingredient substitutions. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Hawaiian consumers rejected the beer almost overnight. Sales collapsed, market share evaporated. The same people who had embraced Primo for generations turned away once the taste changed. The experiment failed so spectacularly that Schlitz was forced to reverse course and return Primo production to traditional methods. It should have been a blaring alarm, but Schlitz executives interpreted it as an isolated regional issue. Hawaii was different, they reasoned. Mainland consumers wouldn't react the same way. The lesson was ignored. Then the lawsuits began. Consumers reported bottles that turned cloudy, developed off flavors, or spoiled prematurely. Distributors filed complaints. Retailers demanded answers. The brewing shortcuts that saved money introduced instability into the product, and once beer quality becomes inconsistent, trust collapses fast. Regulatory scrutiny followed. Schlitz was forced to recall millions of bottles. Shelves emptied again, echoing the disaster of the 1953 strike. Once more, customers walked into stores and found no Schlitz. Once more, competitors filled the gap. Only this time, Schlitz couldn't recover.
Advertising spending exploded in a desperate attempt to win back loyalty, but marketing can't fix a broken product. The more Schlitz tried to reassure consumers, the more obvious the problem became. The brand's image shifted from reliable to risky. By the mid-1970s, sales were in freefall. Market share collapsed, profits vanished. The efficiency model that once delivered record margins now magnified losses. Fixed costs crushed the company. Breweries closed, workers were laid off. Milwaukee, once the proud heart of American brewing, began to lose its identity. The empire was no longer dying slowly, it was collapsing in real time.